Welcome to the Business of Government Hour TV, a video companion to our flagship radio program. I'm Michael Keegan, your host. For 2 decades, the IBM Center for the Business of Government has sought to connect research to practice, engaging authors and academics who in their research and studies contribute in some form or fashion to changing the way government does business. This is a special edition of the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with authors, exploring ideas for improving government effectiveness, with my colleague John Kamensky, author of the IBM Center report, Cross-Agency Collaboration, a case study of cross-agency priority goals. What is the evolution of cross-agency collaboration within the U.S. federal government? And how has the CAP goals impacted the performance of government? I'll discuss these questions and so much more with John. Take a look and take a listen, and you can download the entire interview at iTunes or at businessofgovernment.org. So I'd like to explore the evolution of cross-agency collaboration over the past 2 decades in the federal government. Would you provide us with a historical context around many of these types of initiatives around cross-agency collaboration?
Well, cross-agency collaboration has been around for a long time, but it's always been sort of ad hoc. And it's oftentimes been around a particular initiative or project. So, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Agency would have a response to Katrina and or Hurricane Sandy, and they would need to bring different agencies together to have a single federal face to the communities in which they're working. But this whole notion of collaboration across agencies has reached across a lot of other policy domains. So we're talking about the intelligence community working across agency boundaries. We're talking about in food safety working across agency boundaries and across for social services, et cetera. And it's at the federal, state, and local level. And this is something that is because there's an increasing complexity in how government interacts with citizens. But it's also there is a shift in expectations by citizens of how government will interact with it and or with them. And so and part of that comes from the technology that's evolved over the past couple decades, that people are now expecting different kinds of services from the private sector. They're also having that same expectation that government itself will begin to integrate the way it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so one way of doing that was the creation or the passage of the Government Performance Results Act modernization. So it's that GPRA Modernization Act of 2010. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. One of the things that evolved prior to 2010 were these ad hoc working groups to get the Government Performance and Results Act of 93 shifted the focus of many programs and the government from focusing on spending money and doing activities to organizing around results to be achieved. And those results oftentimes reached across agency boundaries. And what they found was that there's no statutory authority to work across agency boundaries on a regular basis. Could be done ad hoc. One agency takes the lead or something like that. But if you wanted to create some sort of institutional mechanism to do that, you couldn't through statute until the 2010 law was passed. And that law required the Office of Management and Budget to identify a small handful of cross-agency priority goals that the administration would take on for a 4-year period. And that would mean and so some of those had to be mission support and some of them mission delivery. And so they piloted that during the remainder of the first term of President Obama, and then they did the first full set in his second term because the 4 years are to be coterminous with a term of office. And so and that's what I assessed, the first full round of cross-agency priority goals. In the pilot stage, they developed some mechanisms and tested them out, and then they wound up applying them in the second phase. So what happened was that the law requires establishing goals, and then it requires this designation of a goal leader, So there's a human being as opposed to some institution that's sort of put in charge. And then there'd be quarterly progress reports that would be made to a council or a group of senior government officials. Oftentimes it's like the director of OMB and maybe White House and others on the progress. And then the summary of that is to be posted on the web for public viewing so that the public can see what the accountability is and the progress around each of the goals.
That's great. So, when you look across the 15 CAP goals, and your report does a wonderful job of this, you identify some characteristics and make some observations. Could you tell us a little bit more about those?
Well, one of the things that we saw in the CAP goals was that some of the goals were fairly mature and were along the way. So for example, in cybersecurity, there was an executive order. There was already an existing team that worked across agencies, et cetera. And the goal was to focus on a subset to really sort of get some things moving quickly. What I thought was interesting was that the governance structure was in place for most of the 15 prior to them being designated. I thought that was kind of interesting that you would have an interagency open data working group and a steering committee on federal infrastructure permitting and review. But there was a lot of times these were groups that got together to talk about things but not necessarily do things. And I think the cross-agency priority goal created this implementation is how do we get something done together as opposed to how do we just communicate and coordinate. The other thing that I thought was also interesting was that a third of the goals actually wound up being revised during the 4-year period because the world changed. Mm-hmm. So, for example, there was a particular goal looking at insider threat, reducing insider threats. And after the shooting at the Navy Yard, it went from just cybersecurity to actual physical security. And then after the Office of Personnel Management data breach, it shifted back to cybersecurity. So real-world events can influence how these goals are structured, managed, and the cadence that they follow through on. Another one is the VA goal that they had on looking at mental health issues. And with the increase in veteran suicides, they created a special focus on suicide prevention. And so they wound up shifting that goal to focus more on some things like that. The other thing I noticed was that the ability to measure the goals really varied. There was some where the goal description of their progress was more qualitative, and some where it was actually much more quantitative. I thought it was very interesting. There was a goal on how do you move things from federal labs to commercial markets. And I thought, boy, that's going to be tough. But they had very interesting metrics that they were able to develop on how many patents actually wound up turning into products and stuff. But there was like a couple-year lag in the data. Right? And and so that makes it harder to be a cross-agency priority goal when you have quarterly reporting on progress. So some of the reporting was like activities of meetings and reports and stuff, so which were less helpful or meaningful. But the longer-term metrics was the ones that I thought were significant. The other thing is, as I was mentioning earlier, the cross-agency priority goals in the old world of collaboration were around a specific project that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, like recovery from a hurricane or something. Many of these goals are things that are long-term sustainability. So in some cases, this is kind of like the being designated as a cross-agency priority goal is a kickstart of creating a core team that's able to work together on a sustainable basis over time. And that's where you can wind up saying you can graduate from being a cross-agency priority goal. It doesn't necessarily need – it's not that it's not a priority any longer. It's just that it's self-sustaining and is able to run on its own. The one, for example, with the commerce example of job investments from overseas, the Commerce Department found that they were having trouble getting the attention of people in the State Department to work out of the embassies overseas on being basically, salespeople for bringing jobs to the U.S. But once it was created as a cross-agency priority goal, the State Department jumped on board, and it was because there was high-level White House interest on what's going on, and the career State Department Foreign Service people were actively engaged in this. And so that was something that just by designating something that had been pre-existing as a priority goal where there was attention, people were going to then spend more time and prioritize on it. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that these were designated early in the second term, and there was no funding associated because there was no statutory authority. There was statutory authority to have funding, but it just never happened. So most of these goals didn't get some sort of financial support specifically as cross-agency priority goal until the last year of the administration. So it was like March or April of 2016. And then that meant that they were able to hire a full-time executive director or something like that. Now, each of these programs had different kinds of funding streams prior to that, and some of them were able to do that under previous legislative authority. But some of these, like customer service, there was no place to do that. So that was able to get some of these goals that had sort of been marching time to actually be able to move forward quickly in at least the last year.
So as you point out, I mean, none of this would be possible without teams of people. And so the next question I was really wanted to talk about was how did the agencies effectively collaborate on the CAP goals, and what were some of the elements that went into the effectiveness of these teams?
First of all, it's important to have some authority to act. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned earlier, there were laws that tied this stuff together, but also executive orders. So you needed to have, for example, in the people and culture goal, one of the elements was to streamline hiring authority. There was a presidential directive to help bolster that, so they weren't on their own. In the goal that looked at streamlining the infrastructure process, there was an executive order. Subsequently, there was a law that reinforced that. So to the extent that there was authority to act so that the goal leader had something to work from. The other was having a goal leader that was more than just other duties as assigned. And that's where having a joint goal leader and having the ability to have a full-time career person to help run the thing made a difference. Examples like Anne Rung, who was the head of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, she was the champion for the category management cross-agency priority goal, and she really ran forward with that. The other was Dave Mader, who was the controller at the Office of Management and Budget. He really ran forward with the shared services cross-agency priority goal. So, and in the case of Carolyn Colvin, who was the acting commissioner of Social Security, she was the champion for the customer service goal. So where you have goal leaders that invest time and have a staff support, you really get a lot more progress on doing that. So those are some of the things that are really important.
So, John, successful implementation of individual CAP goals is premised on an effective cross-functional team that span organizational boundaries, as you point out in your report. How is the federal government, and you kind of touched on this a little bit with several of your examples, building capacity internal to take on these cross-agency collaborative initiatives?
A number of years ago, one of my heroes, Thad Allen, who was the head of the Coast Guard, led cross-agency initiatives, the recovery from Katrina, the Deepwater oil spill, the Haitian earthquake response. And when he retired, I asked him, where are the next Thad Allens that can work across agency boundaries? And he said there is no mechanism in the government to create that. Well, in 2014, President Obama signed an executive order based on a review of reforming the senior executive service. And in the executive order, they talked about the need to create this pipeline or this cadre of people that had cross-agency management experience, because most people work in an agency and rarely have this opportunity to do that. So there was something called the White House Leadership Development Program, and it was people that are at a GS-15 level on the edge of their SES candidate material that are nominated by their deputy secretary for a year-long stint to work at OMB and GSA, and basically they wind up working as the staff cohort behind the cross-agency priority goals. And so having people that are at the staff level working on these things, and when they created this program, they made sure that the people that were designated to work on a goal didn't have that as their prior background. So they're trying to push people out of their comfort zone to learn the tools as opposed to the substance, and how do you work and become basically a neutral broker. So somebody, for example, that was doing the science, technology, engineering, and math goal of increasing the number of students that graduate with a science-related degree in this country, reaching across something like 200 different programs. And these programs had their little niche and stuff. This person came in as a neutral convener across all these different disciplines and was seen as trustworthy as that, because she didn't have some axe to grind in math or science or physics or something like that. So it actually turned out to work. And so they're building these cadres or cohorts year after year, and they're going to ultimately, over the years, have a cadre of people, of staff in the government that have had this cross-agency experience, and then will be able to have those kind of capacities and tools. This is being run as a separate program out of GSA. It works with the Performance Improvement Council. But the Performance Improvement Council and the President's Management Council also are sponsoring their own kinds of developmental programs at lower levels. And so, again, there's just developing a longer-term capacity building across the government in doing this. What I think may happen at some point is that, given all that's going on, is some sort of step back and lessons learned. And I think that they're maybe not quite at that level yet. Mm-hmm. The other is that over the past couple decades, there have been laws to create cross-agency councils like the Chief Information Officers Council and the Chief Financial Officers Council. And those councils sort of ran independently with their own statutory authority. In the Obama administration, they created an umbrella office that ran or staffed all of these different things. And this is called the Office of Executive Counsel. And they have been a new nucleus of where you can do cross-agency stuff on the mission support side.
What has been the impact of CAP goals?
Well, the thing that I don't know whether it's good or bad, but the step back snapshot that I had is that there have been tangible but not necessarily quantitative achievements of effort in both the mission and the mission support areas. And I raised this with some folks in OMB, and they said, well, the goal is to make progress. It's not necessary to meet a target. And that a lot of this is trying to get people to work together to achieve something as opposed to achieving some sort of quantitative target. And I said, well, okay, but it's nice to be able to measure things quantitatively. So some of the goals, it was fairly straightforward to be able to determine. So, for example, the cybersecurity goal, did all the departments meet their requirements of achieving the cybersecurity compliance and stuff? But compliance is different than actually did cybersecurity problems go away or reduce. So it's sort of odd like that. But the other is that you have a look at, and for the mission support goals, typically what happened was that their overall success was they created more standardization. There was consolidation of duplicative services, and there was cost savings. So those are the kinds of things in the cross-agency goals that were related to mission support. You could say those kinds of things happen, and you can provide some metrics related to that. There was a goal on smarter IT delivery, and they had this dashboard that they were able to track the savings over time of reducing duplicative service. For the missions focused CAP goals, the progress and outcomes were, as I mentioned, a little bit more diffuse, but some of them were actually measurable. The infrastructure permitting CAP goal was to how do you better navigate the labyrinth of individual infrastructure projects. And they created this permitting dashboard where all the different agencies could see where a particular project was at, as well as the people that were running the project. They could see where the government agencies were at. So this was a really beneficial platform. It's not that they wound up eliminating regulations or anything. They just made this transparent, and they could see where the different players are. Who do you call whenever you run into something? Mm-hmm. So those kinds of things, while it wasn't quantitative, was able to move the ball forward.
So, you mentioned earlier, and from your perspective, I'm wondering if you mentioned the infrastructure being a big priority for this current administration and the permitting aspect of it, getting it done as a potential for a CAP goal. Are you seeing anything on the street, so to speak, any other areas of interest that you think the Trump administration will be pursuing?
It's kind of hard to guess on that. My guess is there will be something in the human capital people dimension, simply because that's such a critical element of government moving forward. But I really don't have guesses for some of the others, and I think that the administration actually has developed these goals. They are in the upcoming budget, so. The staff at the staff level, it's known because they're starting to do training sessions and they're starting to pull people together. Okay. So, but I just don't know on what specific topics they are, and I think it's appropriate for me not to know.
Oh yeah, and they're building on from your perspective, they're building on the foundation that was laid before.
And that is actually a very interesting point. Okay. Since the '93 Government Performance and Results Act, 25 years ago, each administration came in with its own vision of how performance management would be done. And so they would spend the first term creating a new system and communicating it and training and getting everything, and then sort of have a little bit of time left to implement it. Mm-hmm. The Trump administration is the first to adopt the existing system. And I think that by doing that, they're going to give themselves a 3 or 4 year run room. There's monies that have been appropriated to do cross-agency goals for the first time, and it took the Obama administration 7 years to get to that point. There's staff that at the Performance Improvement Council, it took 3 or 4 years to get to that point. So they're taking this stuff that's there, and they're applying their own priorities as opposed to creating a new system from scratch and starting over. So I think that there's a real opportunity to get some cool things to happen.
Be sure to join us next time on the Business of Government Hour TV for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government effectiveness. Until then, it's businessofgovernment.org.